If I'm doing a seminar anywhere in southern Africa, especially various parts of South Africa, and I mention his name, if there are people from his church in the audience, in the seminar, I can tell immediately because they're smiling from ear to ear. Because they say, that's the way he was. Yes, he taught us to tithe. $2 million in the collection. Just a couple of other illustrations. In 1938, the Italian invasion in Ethiopia drove out all the missionaries. They were gone for 5 years. When the Italians left and the missionaries came back in, the 100 believers that they left in 1938 became 10,000 in a 5-year period with no money from the outside and no missionaries from the outside. In China in 1951, missionaries were forced out of China. Many went into internment camps and suffered, and some died. They left about 1 million believers behind in 1951, but 30 years later, the 1 million had become 50 million. No money from the outside going into China. No missionaries from the outside going into China. In East Africa in the 1970s, the Presbyterian Church of East Africa elected a man as their moderator by the name of John. And when he took over the position, he was an African. He said, what kind of church is this? We can't even pay the salary of the moderator. We have to beg for money from Scotland to pay the salary of the moderator. He decided there was something unhealthy about that. So he asked the people in Scotland, keep your money. Don't send any money for 5 years. Don't send us any missionaries for 5 years. And don't make any decisions for us for 5 years. Very quickly, they got on their own 2 feet. They began to pay their own pastors, build their own buildings, buy vehicles for their pastors. They planted new congregations each year. They started a pension fund for their pastors, something they were told wouldn't work in Africa, but they did it. And then they heard one day that there are homeless children on the streets of Edinburgh, Scotland, the place where their money always came from. And they said, we should do something to say thank you to God for the salvation we received. So they took a collection for homeless children in Scotland, and they collected 200,000 Kenya shillings for a home for children's shelter of some kind, children's home in Scotland, which I calculated at the time was about $30,000. The same people who could not afford to pay their moderator without getting money from the outside. Now, two of the words that you'll often hear today are partnership and interdependence. What do you think of those? What do I think of them? Let me give you an idea. How do you test a partnership? You just ask, how many directions do the resources flow? And if the resources flow in only one direction, then I question whether partnership is the right term. I suggest it might better be called sponsorship. So don't kid yourself that if it's a partnership and the resources only go in one direction, maybe it's better to call it sponsorship. What about interdependence? That's a popular one. People really like that one. Well, this man, John, that I was talking about, came up with this term, local interdependence. And we said to him, John, what do you mean by that? He said, I mean here in East Africa, we in the Presbyterian Church should become interdependent with the Methodist Church of Kenya, with the Anglican Church of Kenya, with the AIM, or the AIC rather, the African Inland Church. That's local interdependence. He said, that's the kind I believe in. I have a question for you about Christian hospitals. Can Christian hospitals or mission-established hospitals become self-supporting? It depends on many things, such as the beginning assumptions, how they were started, the location, what country are they in, history, economics, politics. It also depends on the will to make it happen. I was at the big medical conference conference in Louisville last year. And as I was waiting to leave, I was waiting for a colleague to come and join up with me. We were going to the airport. And a man saw me standing there, and he came over to tell me a story. He said, "I just want to tell you what happened." He said, "I'm a medical doctor, and I was running a hospital in Ghana. And someone suggested that I get a hold of your video series, our video series on dependency. We have an 8-hour video series, which is actually incorporated in this book now. But he said, so we got your video series on dependency, and my wife and I sat and watched it. And when we finished watching it, we asked ourselves, what should we do differently based on what we learned in this video series?" And he said, "I just want you to know that was 10 years ago that we did that. Since that time, that hospital has become 100% supported with local resources and 100% staffed with Ghanaian people." And if I ask the question, can Christian hospitals become self-supporting? The answer is yes. There are many examples. Let me tell you about this one, Tumu Tumu. Anybody here ever hear of Tumu Tumu Hospital? So I'll be careful what I say now, right? Tumu Tumu is a Presbyterian hospital in Kenya. While other good things were happening in the Presbyterian Church, this hospital was not making much progress towards self-reliance, and so the people who were funding it from overseas, from Scotland, said, "Close the hospital." The local people said, "Wait a minute, how can people who are so far away say that our hospital should be closed? Let us take it over." So they did. Local people took it over. Now, it was about 150 kilometers from Nairobi. They organized a march from a place called Kikuyu, which is a suburb of Nairobi, to march 150 kilometers in a group. They had medical people in the group. They had evangelists, pastor types in the group. They would have roadside clinics along the way, and they would have prayers in the evening, and they were marching toward Tumu Tumu. People would say to them, "Why are you marching?" They'd say, "We're trying to save our hospital. Help us." By the time they reached Tumu Tumu, they had enough momentum to take over the hospital and refurbish it. They fixed it. They painted it. They put equipment in it. They built latrine blocks. The missionaries are often quite capable of using graphic language to describe things, but those latrine blocks, they decided, the local people who took over the hospital, they decided those latrine blocks should be clean enough that you could eat a meal in there if you want. Never heard of a missionary saying that sort of thing, but the local people who decided to take over that hospital, they set up rules for who could, what they could drink and what they could not, and they dismissed several people. All of this was done as part of the taking over of Tumu Tumu Hospital. But the support of the hospital increased, whereas it was getting 5% of its income was coming in locally. The transformation of Tumu Tumu Hospital resulted in it going to 95% local income and only 5% at the time I learned about this story. The overseas funders developed what we call donor fatigue, and that threatened the hospital. Local people decided to take it over. The result is that Tumu Tumu Hospital was saved. Can hospitals be rescued? Can they be saved? They can be. I talk a lot about what I call psychological ownership. And what is clear in this story is that local people took ownership of that. They said, "This is ours, we can do it, let's organize a march, let's get other people involved." And when the psychological ownership belonged to people far away, it was much more difficult. And you can find this story, if you want, on the WMAUSA.org website, called The Transformation of Tumu Tumu Hospital. Where in the world is Clinica Biblica? How many of you know about Clinica Biblica? Ooh. More people know about Tumu Tumu than Clinica Biblica. This is a hospital in San Jose, Costa Rica, where the President of the United States was taken once upon a time. because he was traveling in that area and needed medical attention, he was taken to Clinic of Eagleton. That was way back in the days of John Kennedy. But that was that hospital was capable of handling the needs of the President of the United States. In this case, Clinic of Eagleton was a mission-established hospital, and it suffered from mission fatigue. I said a while ago donor fatigue, but this one I call mission fatigue, because the mission said, this thing is not helping us to do evangelism. Let's close this hospital. The mission said, close the hospital. It was started by missionaries in 1929 and was threatened with closure in the 1960s. But psychological ownership, the term I used a while ago, was transferred in the 1970s. The result, Clinic of Eagleton was saved because local people took it over, and several years ago they launched a $23 million addition to the hospital, just to let you know that it wasn't just a small clinic on the side of the road. It was a proper hospital. $23 million addition. Let me give you some observations on Clinic of Eagleton. Those who are skeptical of local sustainability will always find things to criticize. As much as 40% of the profit is returned to the community. How do they have so much profit that they can feed it back into the poverty-stricken parts of the community? Well, some say that Clinic of Eagleton overcharges the rich in order to help the poor, you know, the Robin Hood syndrome, or what in, I understand, medical and hospital terminology is called crossover income. Some say the evangelistic fervor has diminished since it got out of the hands of the mission. Others say that being a poor mission hospital is no guarantee that the spiritual emphasis will be strong. But here's what I believe. You can be sure that Clinic of Eagleton is no longer draining mission funds intended for evangelism. It's a hospital which was taken off of the missionary role, funding role, supported by the work that it does in the community, and was being done much better and bigger than it was when it was being done by mission funds. What about Wanga Hospital in Congo? This is the one where Dr. Dan Fountain worked for 35 years. They decided to start rural health clinics. This is the way they dealt with the enormous number of people that needed care. They began with this idea that curing should be close to where curing is needed. That sounds like the indigenous principle, doesn't it? Rural health clinics can be funded and built with local resources. Big hospitals oftentimes require foreign resources. Not always, but sometimes. These rural health clinics, these 50 that they started, could be built by local people in their own villages. Rural clinics take the pressure off of medical staff in large hospitals. Because many people who are treated in those rural clinics never get to the hospital. The cost of overhead is considerably lower in rural clinics compared to large hospitals. And medical professionals who visit rural clinics see illness in context. Dr. Dan Fountain, if you haven't read anything he's written, you should get it. If you're in medical missionary work at all, get a hold of the things that he has written. He deals with the importance of sanitation and nutrition and confronting the spirit world and all of those things put together. To learn about Wanga Hospital, read anything written by Dr. Dan